Dawn slid over the Serengeti like a slow breath, the grass taking on a soft gold as the night backed away. In a pocket of thorn and stone, a lioness named Amara lay still, her sides heaving after a long, stubborn labor that had stretched most of the night. The air was cool and clean. Birds had not yet found their voices. Even the wind seemed to wait. Then came the smallest sound in the world, a cub's first cry. Another followed. Amara shifted, licking steadily, cleaning blood and birth from two tiny bodies, the color of dry straw. They pressed against her belly, searching with blind mouths, the way all new life searches for the one thing it understands. She curled around them, a quiet circle of warmth and muscle and breath. The third cry was different. It was thin, as if it had a long way to travel. Amara lifted her head and saw what the light was only just beginning to show. The third cub was not straw-colored, not gold, not the soft tan that hides a youngster in this yellow country. He was black, not dark brown, not shadowed tan. Black, like the last inch of night that refuses to leave. Amara paused, as if her body had remembered something old and heavy. She lowered her head and began to lick him, too, slower this time, as if to make sense of what her tongue knew better than her eyes. He was hers. A mile away, on a rise where the grass bowed gently, a man adjusted a long lens. Ethan Carter had been in this country long enough to know how morning works on the land. He had learned to sit and wait, to let his breathing match the bush. He knew the pride by their marks and their habits, knew Amara by the pale notch in her left ear. He had not come for miracles. He had come for honest days. But when he found the den and steadied the camera, the first frame showed him something his books had never promised. He leaned closer. He did not dare whisper, though his own breath surprised him. The third cub moved, and the glass answered with a small, shaking image of black fur that caught the new light with a faint shine. Ethan's hands remembered every lecture he had ever heard, and then forgot them all. He watched. Amara worked carefully, licking the little dark body until it gleamed wet and new. The cub squirmed and reached for her with a small paw, then tried to drag himself toward the warmth where his brothers had already found a place. He was slower, as if weight lived in his limbs. Amara nudged him closer and held still, patient in that way only a mother can be, letting him figure out where the world begins. The sun climbed a little. Loose flies found the den and were brushed away by Amara's tail. The two pale cubs made soft, satisfied sounds. The dark one rested and tried again. He found a teat at last, and his whole body trembled with the work of pulling life into himself. Amara breathed through her nose, a calm, steady sound. She kept one foreleg braced near the entrance, eyes half closed, ears working, listening for anything that did not belong. It did not take long for the rest of the pride to notice. One by one, shapes moved through the grass with the steady forward motion of lions that have seen this scene before. Suri came first, the big female whose jawline carried old stories, her stride even, her head high. Two younger lionesses followed at a respectful distance, pausing to scent the air, to read the day. Amara lifted her head but did not stand. Suri stopped just outside the shadow line of the den. She looked at Amara, then at the two pale cubs, and her expression softened the way it always does when a lioness sees new life. She leaned in, nose forward, and breathed them in. The milk, the damp, the soft pulse of something barely begun. A low, approving rumble passed through her chest. Then the dark cub moved. It was only a small push of his hind legs and a tilt of his head as he tried to keep hold. But the light caught him all the same, marked him like ink on paper. Suri's ears tipped back a fraction. It was not a snarl, not a threat. It was hesitation, a tiny hook in the long rope of instinct. The younger females held still, their mouths barely open as they drew scent. One of them lowered her head and then pulled back, as if she had reached for a familiar step and found empty air. Ethan watched through glass that suddenly felt too small. He knew words like melanism, knew how rare it was, knew how color could be more than color in a place where survival depends on blending with the earth. He knew, too, that lions are not cruel. They are practical in a way that we sometimes mistake for hardness. He wrote a single line on a small card by his knee. Dark cub with Amara, moving, nursing, pride hesitant. Amara kept her eyes on Suri. Nothing in her face changed. Only the tip of her tail moved. The dark cub finished his work and rested his chin on his mother's fur. Amara lowered her head, and for a moment the world was only the sound of breathing. Two steady, one uneven and light, the fourth slower and heavy with the weight of command. Suri stayed like that for a long count of seconds. Then the hard line in her shoulders eased. She stepped back, not far, just enough to give the den its small sacred space. The younger lionesses followed. There was no ceremony, no announcement, only the quiet recognition that something had entered their world that would need watching. The sun rose higher. Heat came in little waves you could see if you looked past the obvious. Amara shifted again, stretching a hind leg with care. The dark cub tumbled, then righted himself with the determined clumsiness of the new. He was not strong, not yet, but he was here. He gave a small, breathy sound that was not quite a cry and not quite a sigh. Amara answered by resting her chin lightly across his back, the way a mother reassures without moving the world. Ethan lowered the camera and let his eyes do the work for once. He felt that old ache that sometimes comes when the bush shows you something, simple and true. He wanted to believe that this morning would be enough, that warmth and milk and a mother's body might be all it takes to write a good beginning. But even from his small hill, the plain told him the rest of the story. The grass was gold, the ground was dust. Everything here had learned to be the color of the sun. He looked again at the dark cub and felt a slow pull behind his ribs, the kind that tells you a choice is coming, though you can't yet see its shape. Amara slept in short, shallow pieces, the way wild mothers do. When she woke, she counted by touch and by smell, and each time her breath settled when it reached 3. She licked each small head in turn and then pressed her nose into the dark cub's neck. He twitched, startled, then relaxed again. The day grew louder. Birds, insects, the small sounds lions ignore. Far off, a herd of zebra pushed a thin line across the land. Toward noon, a cloud passed and gave them a brief blessing of shade. The dark cub tried to crawl over his brother and slid back, his paws paddling at the short air. Amara steadied him with a paw, not rough, not gentle, simply certain. He found his footing and tucked himself under her foreleg, hidden from the sky. If he had a name, it lived only in the steady drum of his mother's heart. Ethan raised the camera again and framed the den with the clean edges of his glass. He took a slow sequence, each shot a breath apart, the way you might count a prayer. He could feel the opening lines of a story he did not control, a story older than the grass, older than the wind. Still, he wrote another note. Day 1. 3 cubs, 1 black. Feeding. Amara calm. Pride uncertain. Watch. Wait. The sun moved on. Shadows changed their minds and settled in new places. Somewhere beyond the reach of sound, the pride would hunt again tonight. For now, there was only this small room of earth and fur and milk. Amara closed her eyes. The dark cub's sides rose and fell under her chin, shallow but steady, like a tiny boat learning a big ocean. The day finished the work it had started, and the plain lay open, honest about what it gives and what it takes. Far up on the rise, a man sat very still and promised himself he would remember this morning exactly, because some beginnings already carry the shape of what they will ask of you in the end. The morning after the birth settled into a soft haze of dust and heat. The Serengeti seemed half asleep, holding its breath between night hunts and the burning afternoon. Ethan Carter sat at his small wooden table in the outpost, the kind of table that creaks when you lean on it, and looked again at the photographs from yesterday. He had seen a lot in his years here: scar-faced lions, droughts, hyena raids, but never anything like this. In every frame, the little black cub glowed against its surroundings, as if it carried a piece of the night still wrapped around its fur. He turned one photo toward the light. The color was deep and rich, not the washed-out brown of shade, but true black, shining blue where the sun hit it. He felt the same tug behind his ribs that he had felt out there on the hill. The image made him uneasy. Beauty often did when it showed up in places it shouldn't. The door of the outpost creaked open. Dr. Grace Holloway stepped in, dust clinging to her boots. She had spent 2 decades studying big cats and spoke of them the way some people speak of family, practical but with a trace of reverence. Ethan slid the photograph toward her without a word. She studied it for a long time, squinting as if the picture might change under her stare. "Melanism," she said finally, her voice flat with the certainty of science. "It's the opposite of albinism, too much pigment instead of too little. It happens in leopards sometimes, never in lions, at least not out here." Ethan waited for something gentler, maybe a note of wonder, but Grace just sighed. "That cub's beautiful, yes, but he won't last long. Color like that screams against the grass. Predators, prey, everyone will see him. The pride won't tolerate the risk." Ethan frowned. "He's just a cub. His mother will protect him." "She'll try," Grace said, taking off her hat. "But instincts have a longer memory than love. When food gets scarce, when hunts fail because of him, she'll know what to do. They all will." She tapped the photo with one finger. "If you're going to watch, don't interfere. Let nature decide." He nodded, though the words sat in his throat like stones. Out here, rules kept people from becoming part of the story. But sometimes, he thought, stories didn't ask for permission. By late afternoon, he was back on the ridge with his camera. Heat shimmered over the plain like invisible water. Through his lens, he found the pride scattered near a dry riverbed. Amara lay in the shade, the cubs pressed close. The 2 golden ones played with each other, pawing and tumbling in clumsy practice for a life they would someday rule. The black cub, Shadow, Ethan had started to call him, sat apart, watching, small and uncertain. When the older lionesses approached, Ethan adjusted his focus. Suri came first, her body a graceful weight of muscle and confidence. She sniffed at the golden cubs, rumbling approval. But when she reached the dark one, her nostrils flared, and the sound she made wasn't approval, it was doubt. She stepped back, tail twitching. One of the younger lionesses gave a low growl, almost a question. Amara rose slowly, placing herself between them and her son. The movement was quiet, but absolute. She didn't snarl, she didn't bare teeth. She simply stood, her head lowered, eyes steady on Suri. Ethan could almost feel the silence through the glass. A tense, invisible cord pulled tight between instinct and defiance. Finally, Suri turned away, but not before giving a small, warning rumble. The other females followed, tails flicking. Amara lay, back down, gathering her cubs close. The black one crept against her side and buried his face in her fur. Ethan saw her nose twitch toward the spot where Suri's scent lingered, then she closed her eyes as if to erase it. He lowered the camera and sat still for a long time, feeling the weight of what he'd seen. Grace's words came back. Instincts have a longer memory than love. He wrote in his notebook, Day 2. Pride uneasy. Mother protective. Tension growing. The sun slid behind a thin veil of cloud, turning everything gray for a moment. That evening, a wind picked up from the east, carrying the smell of rain that would never reach them. Ethan watched lightning far away and thought about the cub, how a single difference could rewrite an entire destiny. The next morning he rose before dawn and returned to the same hill. Mist hung low, thick enough that the land seemed smaller. The Pride had moved to a shallow hollow near a line of acacia trees. He set up the lens and waited. Amara appeared first, stretching, her muscles rippling beneath pale fur. The cubs followed her out into the soft light. The two golden ones chased each other immediately, full of new strength. Shadow lingered at the edge, then tried to join them. His movements were awkward, his legs unsteady, but he kept trying. When he stumbled, Amara nudged him upright with her muzzle. For a second, Ethan smiled. It looked almost normal. 3 cubs, 1 mother, 1 morning. But then Suri arrived. The leader paused, staring straight at the black cub. She moved closer, sniffed again, then gave a harsh snort that made the golden cubs freeze. She brushed past Amara roughly, leaving no doubt who ruled here. Ethan could see Amara's tail lash once, twice. She didn't move otherwise. Pride politics were delicate. One wrong reaction could end in exile. She waited until Suri walked away, then bent to her son, licking the top of his head over and over, faster than before, as if trying to scrub the doubt off him. Grace's radio crackled in Ethan's ear. Her voice was steady but thin with static. "You're too close again. Remember what I said. Nature doesn't need witnesses who forget they're human." He wanted to answer, to explain that sometimes watching felt like betrayal, but he kept silent. The cub stumbled again, and the urge to step down that hill almost tore him in half. Instead, he adjusted the lens and forced himself to see, not as a savior, but as a storyteller. The day grew hotter, dust rose with each breath of wind. Amara led the cubs to a shaded patch of scrub. The others followed, forming a loose circle of fur and muscle. The black cub crawled toward one of the younger females, tail low, trying to imitate the greeting he had seen between his siblings and the adults. The lioness sniffed him once, then hissed, swiping a paw that stopped an inch from his nose. He fell backward and squeaked, a sound too small for the wild. Amara stood again, her patience fraying, but she stayed quiet. Ethan could see the line forming. Suri's dominance, the other's caution, the cub's isolation, and the mother caught in between. The story was already writing itself. That evening, Grace joined him on the hill. They watched in silence until the light went soft. "You think she'll keep him?" she asked finally. "She will," Ethan said, though his voice wasn't sure. "She's different." Grace shook her head. "They all start out that way, then instinct wins." She paused, eyes on the horizon where the first stars blinked awake. If she doesn't let him go, the Pride will do it for her. They have to hunt together. One weakness, one wrong color, it can bring everything down. Ethan didn't answer. Below them, the Pride began to move, slipping through the grass like ghosts, the cubs left hidden in their den. The land swallowed them quickly. Only the faint cry of the dark cub remained, soft and uncertain. When the sound faded, Grace packed her binoculars. "You can't fix this, Ethan." "I know." He looked back through the lens one last time. The den was empty except for the shadows moving in the wind. "But I can remember it," she sighed. "Remembering doesn't change anything." He smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Sometimes it does. That night he developed the photos under the dim red glow of the lab lamp. The images came alive slowly, the black cub emerging from white paper like a secret surfacing from water. Ethan touched the edge of the print, careful not to smudge it. Outside, thunder rolled again, too far away to bring rain. He thought of Grace's warning, of Suri's hesitation, of Amara's quiet defiance. He wrote another line in his notebook before turning off the light. "The black cub lives. For now. The pride is watching. So am I." Then he sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the night breathing outside his window, wondering which would last longer, instinct or love. The days stretched longer now, heat bending the air until even the trees seemed to sway without wind. Ethan Carter woke each morning before dawn, set his camera, and watched the same hill, the same patch of grass where life and struggle played out in slow, brutal beauty. The pride had settled along the riverbed, a strip of cracked earth that hadn't seen water in months. Dust rose with every step, and flies ruled the afternoon. Still, Amara endured, keeping her cubs alive with the same fierce calm he had seen since the day of their birth. The two golden cubs grew strong quickly. Their steps grew surer, their bellies round with milk and curiosity. They wrestled, bit ears, chased one another through the short grass. Every sound they made was full of life, sharp, demanding, certain. The black cub, though, lagged behind. Ethan could see the difference now, even from a distance. Shadow was smaller by nearly a quarter, his legs thinner, his body built for something gentler than this. Cruel place. He tried to join their games, his movements clumsy and late, but the others often ignored him, too absorbed in their own fierce play. When they tumbled into him, he would fall and lie still, blinking at the sky until Amara nudged him upright again. Each day Ethan wrote notes. Shadow weak but persistent. Keeps close to mother. Pride distant. He told himself he was just recording facts, but sometimes he caught himself whispering encouragement to the cub as if words could travel that far. The pride began taking short hunts again, mostly at night. During the day, Amara kept the cubs hidden under low brush, while Suri led the older females toward the open plains. Sometimes they returned with the sweet smell of blood on their faces, sometimes empty and hungry. When the hunts failed, the tension grew heavy enough to feel through the air. Ethan had learned that hunger changes everything. It rewrites loyalty, patience, even love. One afternoon, while the air shimmered with heat, Suri and two younger females approached the den earlier than usual. Amara lifted her head at once, her body going rigid. Shadow was asleep, stretched against her belly, his sides fluttering with shallow breaths. Suri stopped just outside the shade, watching. The cubs stirred. The golden ones ran forward, tumbling over one another, climbing onto Suri's forelegs. She tolerated them, licking one gently before pushing it away. Then her gaze fell on the black cub. He woke slowly, blinking into the light. The moment he stood, the color of his fur caught the sun like a piece of night set loose in daylight. Suri's ears flattened. She moved closer, too close, sniffing. Amara rose, blocking her path. The two lionesses stared at each other, and for a long, still moment the world around them disappeared. Ethan, behind his camera, barely breathed. Then Suri snarled, low and sharp. It wasn't an attack, more of a warning, a statement of what was coming. She brushed past, the muscles along her back stiff with irritation. The younger females followed her lead, circling once before moving on. But the message was clear. This cub was a problem. Later that evening, Ethan saw Shadow try to play with his siblings again. They swatted at him half-heartedly, then left him behind. He sat watching them, his small dark tail twitching like a trapped shadow. Amara called them all to her when the light faded, gathering them close. Shadow settled at her side, half under her leg, his head tucked against her chest. The golden cub sprawled comfortably across her belly. Ethan could almost see the exhaustion in Amara's eyes, love fighting a losing battle with instinct. A week passed. The cubs grew bolder, exploring the edge of the den. Amara tried to herd them back each time, but they were restless, curious. Shadow followed, slower, dragging his hind leg, as if the effort cost him more than it should. When the golden cubs pounced on a beetle or chased a bird's shadow, he watched, then tried to imitate them, his movements hesitant but determined. One afternoon, the heat broke in a sudden storm. Lightning flashed across the horizon, the thunder distant but deep. The rain never reached the pride, just brushed the far hills with silver. Ethan stayed under a tarp, watching through the downpour. When the clouds thinned, he found the pride huddled together beneath a rock ledge. The cubs were wet and miserable, mewling softly. Shadow pressed so close to his mother's chest that she could barely move. Suri gave a disapproving growl and turned away. That night, when the pride moved to hunt, Amara stayed behind. Ethan saw her silhouette against the darkening sky, the small black cub nestled against her belly. She licked his fur, dry, slow strokes of her tongue, while the thunder rolled far away. The other cub slept. Shadow lifted his head once, blinked at her, and let out a weak, rasping sound. She answered with a soft chuff, a mother's voice in a language older than words. By dawn, the pride returned empty. Suri's frustration was obvious in the way she moved, her shoulders tight, her tail cutting the air. The others followed her lead, uneasy and silent. Amara greeted them carefully, letting her cubs run out to meet their aunts. Shadow lingered near the den. One of the younger females, Ethan recognized her as Tali, barely 3 years old, approached him. She sniffed, then swiped lightly at his flank, not in play, but in warning. The cub squealed and darted back to Amara. Suri watched everything. When the golden cubs approached her, she welcomed them with warmth, but when Shadow peeked out again, she turned her head away. Ethan caught that moment, his camera clicking once, twice. The sound felt almost cruel. Days later came the first serious hunt since the dry season began. Ethan followed from a distance, his vehicle crawling over the hard earth. The cubs were left near a cluster of rocks, watched over by 2 of the younger females. From where he parked, he could see the golden cubs chasing each other, while Shadow sat apart, tracing circles in the dust with his paw. When the hunting party returned late that night, their bellies were still empty. Ethan heard the snarls echo across the plain. The next morning, Suri stalked straight toward Amara's den. Ethan felt the air shift. Amara rose to meet her halfway. Their bodies didn't touch, but the space between them burned with the promise of violence. The black cub peered out from behind his mother's leg, unaware of how much his existence cost. The standoff lasted only seconds. Suri turned sharply and left, tail high, her message delivered without words. Amara sank back to the ground, trembling slightly. The cubs, sensing the tension, stayed still. Shadow crept closer to his mother and buried his face in her fur. Ethan lowered his camera and sat back, his chest tight. He knew what came next. He had seen it before, with other species, other mothers. The pride had begun to separate the weak from the strong. It was never about cruelty. It was survival, pure and cold as stone. That evening, when the sun dropped low and red across the horizon, Ethan watched the cubs from his ridge. The light turned everything to gold except for the one that refused to reflect it. Shadow's fur swallowed the color, making him look almost like an absence rather than an animal. For a moment, Ethan thought he saw Amara studying her son in that dying light, her expression unreadable. He wrote one more note before the darkness came. The black cub grows slower, pride restless, conflict near. Then he set the notebook aside and stared out at the open land, wondering how long love could hold against the sun. The savanna burned gold that morning, the grass tall and brittle under the weight of the dry season. Every sound carried for miles, buzzing flies, distant hooves, the restless breathing of predators waiting for the hunt. Ethan Carter sat on the hood of his Jeep, camera balanced on his knee, the lens pointed toward the pride that had now become more a study in tension than in unity. He had watched it all unfold for weeks. The whispers of dominance, the cold glances, the way hunger made the air thick with impatience. But today felt different. Today something waited beneath the surface. Suri, the matriarch, paced near the edge of the clearing, tail flicking like a whip. The pride had failed 3 hunts in a row. Their ribs were beginning to show beneath their coats. The cubs, once round with milk, now cried more often than they played. Ethan could see it in every movement, the heavy anger of lioness denied food too long. Amara lay apart from the others, her 3 cubs pressed close. The 2 golden ones nuzzled her belly, fighting softly for the better spot. The black cub, Shadow, stayed near her hind legs, half hidden in shade. He had grown leaner, his fur dull from lack of nourishment. Ethan adjusted his focus and caught the faint tremor that ran through his legs each time he stood. Suri turned her head, eyes fixed on Amara. The message needed no words. Hunger had made the pride impatient, and difference had made it cruel. When the hunt began that evening, the lions spread out through the tall grass, a formation honed by instinct and survival. Amara followed behind, the cubs trailing until she pushed them toward a nearby ridge for safety. The air hung still, the scent of antelope faint but promising. Ethan followed at a distance, the low hum of his engine drowned by the rustle of grass. The herd grazed about 200 yards away. Suri crouched low, muscles coiled. Nala and Tali flanked her, their golden coats melting into the savanna. It was a perfect setup, until the cubs moved. Ethan saw it before they did. A patch of black fur shifting in the grass, catching the last light of sunset. Shadow had followed his mother, too curious, too young to understand the danger. His color burned against the landscape like ink on parchment. The first alarm. Call from the antelope shattered the silence. Heads shot up, tails flicked, and in seconds the herd scattered like wind-blown leaves. Suri lunged, but her prey was gone. Dust clouded the horizon where dinner had just vanished. The pride's furious roars carried through the dry air, echoing across the plain. Amara turned sharply, eyes finding her cub. Shadow froze, confused, trembling. She charged toward him, not to harm him, but to cover him with her body, her growl cutting through the rising anger of the pride. But it was too late. The damage was done. Ethan's hands shook as he lowered his camera. He could feel the storm building within the pride. Suri approached first, her face twisted with frustration. The younger females followed, their movements sharp, purposeful. The night was falling fast, and in the half-light, their golden coats glowed like embers around Amara's shadowed figure. Suri stopped a few paces away. She didn't roar. She didn't need to. Her silence was colder than sound. She stepped closer, shoulders squared, every line of her body heavy with command. Amara stayed still. The black cub pressed against her foreleg. Ethan could almost hear the conversation, an ancient language of body and breath. Suri's head lowered. Amara's followed. A growl rumbled through the air like a tremor, then another, deeper, older. Amara lowered herself further, submitting but not retreating. When Suri stepped forward again, Amara moved to block her cub. The standoff lasted 15 minutes. Ethan watched through the lens, recording every gesture, the tilt of a head, the twitch of a tail, the narrowing of eyes. It was power versus instinct, dominance versus love, and love, out here, was losing. Finally, Suri backed away, her decision made. The pride turned as one, slipping into the darkness toward the east. Amara stood alone, the cub still huddled close. She did not follow. She lay down slowly, her breath shaking. The night filled with the hum of insects, the distant calls of hyenas, and the soft, uncertain cries of her youngest cub. Ethan stayed long after the pride vanished. His notes were simple this time, his handwriting uneven. Day 39, pride fractured, black cub blamed, Amara isolated. Survival instincts overpower affection. He sat in the dark and listened, waiting for the first hint of dawn to tell him what the pride had decided. By morning, the land looked clean again, as if nothing had happened. The pride rested near a dry stream bed, feeding on a small warthog they had caught in the night. Only Amara was missing. Ethan scanned the plain until he found her tracks leading north, alone. He followed carefully, keeping distance. She moved slow, her cubs trailing. The golden ones followed easily, but Shadow lagged behind, panting with effort. Every few yards, Amara turned to nudge him, her patience steady but fading. They reached a small patch of thorn bushes, the same kind of place where she had given birth weeks ago. There, she stopped. The golden cubs nursed while Shadow tried and failed to find space. When he whimpered, Amara glanced at him and then at the horizon, where dust rose from the direction of the pride. Her tail flicked once, uncertain. She finished feeding the others, licked them clean, and then stood. Shadow looked up, confused. Amara lowered her head and touched her nose to his. It was brief, almost gentle. Then she turned away. She took 2 steps, then 3. He followed, crying softly. At the 4th, she spun, growled, and drove him back toward the bushes. Not a roar, just enough to make him stop. He sat there, his head tilted, watching as she walked away with the other cubs. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, heart pounding. He wanted to shout, to call out, to stop what was happening, but he stayed silent. His camera trembled in his hands as he filmed the small black figure shrinking against the endless gold. When Amara disappeared from view, Shadow cried until his voice broke into silence. The sun climbed higher and the flies returned. He lay down in the same spot his mother had left him, eyes fixed on the horizon. Ethan recorded the moment without breathing. Then he closed his notebook and wrote just one line. Day 40. Amara has chosen. He stayed until night fell, until even the stars began to fade. Somewhere out there, a mother hunted with her pride, and somewhere behind her, in the cradle of thorns, a black cub waited for a sound that would never come. And for the first time since he'd arrived in Africa, Ethan wished he had never learned to watch without acting. The sky that morning was a pale sheet of heat, the kind that seemed to hum. The night before had left Ethan sleepless. He kept replaying the moment Amara turned away from her black cub, the hesitation, the backward glance, the small cry that followed her into the tall grass. It was the sound that stayed in his ears even now, a thin, desperate note that didn't belong to a creature of the wild. It sounded human in the way all suffering does when you can't look away. He drove out before sunrise, his old Land Cruiser rattling over the dry plain. The savannah looked endless, stripped of color, except for the faint shimmer of gold where the sun was beginning to rise. He parked near the thorn patch where he'd last seen Amara. The ground was covered in prints, her paws, the smaller shapes of her golden cubs, and then, apart from them, a lonely trail of smaller, lighter marks. He followed the faint track with his binoculars in one hand and his heart heavy in his chest. When he finally saw the cub, he stopped moving. Shadow was curled under a low bush, a dark knot against the earth. His body barely moved. Every few seconds his ribs lifted, then fell, shallow and weak. Flies clung to his fur, drawn to the dryness around his nose and eyes. Ethan felt the sharp, familiar conflict twist through him. He had sworn, as every conservationist must, not to intervene. Nature has its laws. You document. You do not rescue. You do not rewrite what evolution has already written. But this felt like a betrayal disguised as discipline. He sat on a rock a few yards away, camera resting uselessly in his lap. The cub opened its eyes once, unfocused, then closed them again. Its breathing hitched, a sound halfway between a sigh and a plea. By noon, the air was thick enough to drink. Ethan's canteen was warm in his hand. He raised his binoculars again. No movement, only the whisper of insects and the long hum of the land cooking itself under the sun. When the radio crackled, it startled him. "Ethan, you're still out there?" Grace's voice was small through the static. He hesitated before answering. "I found him." There was a pause. "Don't," she said quietly. "You know what I mean. Don't make this yours. Nature's already decided." Ethan stared at the cub. "Grace, he's barely breathing." "That's what happens," she said. "One dies, the others live. You can't carry every broken thing back to camp." He didn't reply. The silence stretched until the radio hissed again and then went quiet. He waited another hour. 2. The cub still lay there, but its breathing slowed until Ethan began counting between each rise of its chest. He thought of Amara somewhere miles away, her coat blending with the pride, her golden cubs learning how to hunt. He imagined her stopping for just a second, maybe thinking of the weight that used to press against her belly at night. But lions didn't think that way, he reminded himself. They moved forward, always forward. When the wind changed direction, he smelled decay, not from the cub, not yet, but from the earth itself, the kind of smell that tells you how quickly life returns to dust here. Ethan stood. He walked back to the jeep, opened the door, then stopped. His reflection in the window looked tired, older. He could see the small camera around his neck, its lens pointing nowhere. He thought about all the rules he'd followed, rules made by people far away, sitting in offices cooled by machines. They weren't here. They hadn't seen this cub's eyes or heard its cry. They hadn't watched a mother walk away because her heart had no place in the wild. He slammed the door shut and turned back toward the bush. The cub didn't move when he knelt beside it. Up close, Ethan could hear the faint whistle in its breathing, the small rasp of life refusing to quit. He reached out a hand, hesitated, then brushed the dirt from its fur. The cub's eyes opened, dull but aware. For a second, they locked onto his. There was no fear there, only exhaustion, the kind that comes when the fight is too long and the world too wide. "It's all right," Ethan whispered, his voice rough. "You've done enough." He lifted the small body carefully, cradling it against his chest. The heat coming from it was frighteningly faint. He wrapped it in his jacket and carried it back to the jeep, his boots sinking into the dry earth. When he radioed Grace again, his voice was steady. "I'm bringing him in." Her answer came fast. "Ethan, no, that's against protocol. You'll lose your permit, maybe worse." "Then I'll lose it," he said. "I'm not leaving him." There was a long silence, broken only by the hum of static. Then Grace's voice softened. "If you're going to do this, you do it right. Straight to Arusha Sanctuary. Don't stop. Keep him warm. And for God's sake, don't let anyone see you." He smiled faintly. "Copy that." The drive back felt endless. The cub stirred once, letting out a weak, broken sound. Ethan talked to him quietly, nonsense words mostly, the way people talk to things they're afraid to lose. The road shook the jeep, dust rising behind them like smoke. By the time he reached the sanctuary gates, the sun was setting in a red blaze over the plains. Grace was waiting, her arms crossed, expression unreadable. She opened the back door without speaking. Ethan laid the small bundle on a table inside the clinic. The cub's chest rose and fell, barely. Grace looked at him for a long time, then at Ethan. "If this doesn't work," she said, "you don't get to feel righteous about it. I just want him to have a chance," Ethan said quietly. She nodded and began working. Saline, antibiotics, milk replacer warmed over a small flame. Her hands were efficient, her eyes steady. Ethan stood back, helpless and grateful. Hours passed. The cub's breathing steadied a little, though his body was still too weak to move. Grace covered him with a cloth and leaned against the counter. "You realized," she said, "this could change everything. We can't put him back in the wild now. He's touched, handled. He's ours." Ethan looked at the small shape under the cloth. "Then he's lucky we found him first." Grace sighed, shaking her head. "No, Ethan. He's lucky that you still believe luck means anything here." Outside, the night grew cool. The storm that had hovered for days finally broke somewhere in the distance, thunder rolling like slow applause. Ethan sat beside the cub's table long after Grace left, the sound of rain beginning to patter against the tin roof. He thought about all the lines humans draw, between right and wrong, nature and mercy, watching and acting. Somewhere, Amara slept with her pride, unaware that the smallest piece of her still breathed miles away in a human camp. Ethan reached out and rested a hand lightly over the cub's back. The fur was rough under his fingers, but warm. "You're safe now," he whispered. "At least for tonight." The cub shifted slightly, a sound like a sigh escaping its throat. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaustion washing through him. The rain grew heavier, and for the first time in weeks, the land smelled alive again. He closed his eyes and listened, wondering whether he had just saved one life, or rewritten a story that was never meant to be changed. The storm had moved east overnight, leaving the sanctuary soaked and steaming. The smell of wet earth and diesel filled the air as Ethan Carter stepped into the small wooden clinic. Inside, Grace Holloway was already there, leaning over a table under a cone of yellow light. The black cub, Shadow, lay on a folded blanket, breathing slow but steady, his chest rising with a fragile rhythm that seemed to mark time itself. Ethan had barely slept. The decision he made yesterday still echoed in his mind. Out here, the line between saving and interfering was razor-thin, and he had crossed it without hesitation. Now, standing beside the cub, he didn't know if he'd done it for science, for mercy, or just because he couldn't watch another thing die. Grace looked up from her notes. "He made it through the night," she said quietly. "That alone is a miracle." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Then he's a fighter." "Or stubborn," she said. "We'll see which wins." For the next several days, the routine became their world. Grace mixed bottles of formula and antibiotics. Ethan cleaned the cage and kept the small space warm through the cold Serengeti nights. The cub gained strength in small, hesitant steps, first lifting his head, then crawling to the edge of the blanket. His fur, once dull and coarse, began to shine faintly again, black as the deep hours before dawn. Ethan started calling him Shadow out loud now. "You were supposed to disappear," he'd whisper, "and yet here you are." The first time Shadow tried to stand, he wobbled, fell, and squeaked in surprise. Ethan laughed softly, a sound that startled him in the quiet room. It had been a long time since anything in this place had made him laugh. Within 2 weeks, the cub was walking. Within a month, he was following Ethan from one corner of the enclosure to the other, pawing at his boots, nipping with tiny teeth. Grace warned him not to get too close, but even she began leaving the door to her office cracked so she could watch the little creature move. "You do realize," she said one evening, "that you've created a problem." Ethan looked up from the cage. "I thought that was your department." Grace folded her arms. "You've imprinted him. He doesn't know he's a lion anymore. He knows you." Ethan leaned against the table, arms crossed. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe that's what keeps him alive." She gave him a tired smile. "You sound like every idealist who ever walked into this place." By the 3rd month, Shadow was healthy enough to be moved to the open rehabilitation enclosure, a fenced piece of land a few acres wide where rescued animals learned to walk on real ground again. Ethan watched from the gate as Shadow took his first steps into sunlight. He stretched his neck toward the horizon, sniffing the air as if recognizing the wild that had almost erased him. "He belongs out there," Ethan said softly. Grace shook her head. "He belongs nowhere now. Too tame for the wild, too wild for the world." But the world seemed to want him anyway. A journalist visiting the sanctuary saw Shadow and posted a photo online. The image spread like wildfire. A black lion cub standing against a backdrop of gold grass, his blue eyes staring straight into the camera. Within days, news outlets were calling, wanting interviews, footage, stories. They called him the Black Lion of Hope. Donations poured in, enough to fund the sanctuary for an entire year. Ethan hated the attention, but couldn't deny what it brought. "He's helping," Grace said, "even if he doesn't know it." Still, fame came with its own hunger. People wanted more photos, more videos, more proof that miracles existed. Ethan found himself filming Shadow's first hunt inside the enclosure, his first roar, his first attempt to climb the rocks that lined the fence. The videos reached millions. Messages arrived from strangers. "He gives me hope. He reminds us what we've lost. Please don't let him die." But behind every message, Ethan felt the same quiet guilt. The cub's existence had become a story, a symbol for people who would never smell the dust or hear the cries of lions at night. One evening, as the sun burned low and red over the plains, Ethan stood by the fence. Shadow was lying in the grass, his body lean and powerful now, his mane beginning to grow in. Grace joined him, handing him a thermos of coffee. "He's nearly a year old," she said. "You realize that's longer than any of us expected." Ethan nodded. "He's tougher than he looks." Grace's expression softened. "You know what comes next, don't you? They'll want him released. The donors, the press, they'll push for it. Return the lion to the wild. It sounds heroic." Ethan stared at Shadow. "He's not ready." "He'll never be ready," she said. "But sometimes, Ethan, the story's bigger than the truth." That night, Ethan sat in the small office, writing in his notebook. The fan hummed, and the air smelled faintly of medicine and rain. He wrote, "Shadow is alive, and that has changed everything. For him, for us, for what people believe about mercy. But survival has its own cost." He paused, then added, "He was never meant to live, but now that he has, the world won't let him die quietly." The weeks that followed turned Shadow into a global phenomenon. Documentaries were planned, partnerships proposed, and Ethan's face began appearing in articles next to the cubs. Grace handled the media, but Ethan avoided it whenever he could. He preferred the quiet moments, the sound of shadow breathing as he slept, the way he purred when Ethan brushed dirt from his coat. One evening after the last visitors left, Ethan stayed by the fence longer than usual. The sun had set, and the stars were starting to break through. Shadow moved toward him, silent as a whisper, and pressed his nose against the wire. Ethan knelt, meeting his gaze. "You don't belong to me," he said softly. "But I'm starting to wonder if maybe I belong to you." Shadow blinked slowly, then turned away, melting into the tall grass that lined the enclosure's edge. His black coat disappeared completely into the dark, a shadow among shadows. Ethan stood there until the night insects began their chorus. For the first time, he realized that saving one life might have changed everything around it. Laws, beliefs, even himself. He wasn't sure if that was redemption or arrogance, but as he walked back to his cabin, he glanced over his shoulder one more time. Shadow was watching him from the dark, eyes faintly blue in the moonlight. There was strength there now, but something else too. A restlessness, a hunger for something beyond the fences. Ethan whispered to the night, half to the lion, half to himself. "You were never supposed to live, but maybe that's why you must." The wind picked up then, carrying the smell of the wild, the same wind that had once rocked a cradle of thorns, the same wind that would someday call them both back to where the story began. 4 years passed like sand through Ethan Carter's hands. The sanctuary had grown, more fences, more volunteers, more eyes watching the story of the black lion that shouldn't have survived. Shadow had become something between legend and symbol. Children wore T-shirts with his face printed on them. Magazines called him the Miracle of Serengeti. Donations arrived from places Ethan had never heard of, but inside the compound, behind the heavy wire and sun-bleached signs, life was quieter. Shadow had grown into a full adult male, taller than most, muscles rippling beneath that dark coat that still refused to reflect the sun. His mane had come in late but thick, a deep copper under light, almost invisible at dusk. He moved with the slow certainty of a creature who knew its own strength. And yet every evening he paced the far edge of the enclosure, always facing east, where the land stretched into the horizon. Ethan knew what it meant. No cage, no matter how large, could silence what the wild still whispered. Grace Holloway watched from the catwalk above the pens. "He's restless," she said. Ethan nodded. "He's been ready for months." "Ready for what?" she asked. "To die faster?" He looked at her, patient but firm. "To live properly." The debate had gone on for weeks. Conservation authorities, donors, and scientists all disagreed. Releasing a lion raised by humans was reckless, but public pressure had its own gravity. Everyone wanted to see the ending they'd already written, the lion set free, the circle closed. Finally, after endless paperwork and heated arguments, the government granted permission for a monitored release inside a protected zone near the Serengeti. It wasn't true, freedom, but it was close enough to make people believe. Ethan didn't tell anyone what it really meant, that Shadow would have to find his own pride or die trying. The morning of the release was cool, with a thin fog lying low across the plains. Reporters had gathered at the perimeter, cameras ready. Grace hated every second of it, but she stood beside Ethan anyway, her arms crossed tight. "If this goes wrong," she murmured, "we'll be watching it live on every network." Ethan smiled without humor. "Then let's make sure it goes right." Shadow waited inside the transport cage, calm but alert. His eyes moved from Ethan to the horizon and back again. There was no fear in them, only recognition. When the latch dropped, The gate swung open with a metallic groan. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Shadow stepped forward, slow, deliberate, like a king reclaiming a throne. His paws sank into the dirt, and the sound of them, the soft thud of contact between life and land, was louder than any cheer. He paused once, turned his head toward Ethan, and gave a low, breathy sound that might have been a growl, or maybe something closer to a goodbye. Then he walked out into the tall grass and vanished. The reporters erupted behind them. Questions flew, cameras clicked, voices rose. Ethan barely heard them. He stood watching the grass move long after the lion had disappeared, the wind brushing through like fingers across a page, now turning to its final chapter. For the first time in years, the sanctuary felt empty. Grace pretended not to notice the quiet in Ethan's cabin, the untouched meals, the way he drove out alone each morning toward the release site. He told himself it was for research, for data. But deep down, he knew it was something simpler. He missed the sound of another heartbeat beside his own. Weeks passed. Tracks appeared, faint but clear, large paw prints leading toward the river valleys where prey was plenty. Camera traps caught fleeting images. A black shape at dusk, a pair of blue eyes in the dark. Shadow was surviving. More than that, he was thriving. Then came the day that pulled everything back full circle. Ethan's team was filming near the eastern edge of the reserve when one of the rangers called out, "We've got movement! Pride of 6, coming in from the hills." Ethan raised his binoculars. The lead lioness moved with power and precision. Her coat was pale gold, her left eye rimmed by a scar that caught the sun. Amara. The world seemed to fall silent. The other lionesses trailed her, followed by 2 nearly grown cubs. They stopped to drink from the shallow river, unaware of the watchers nearby. Ethan's breath caught as a darker shape emerged from the opposite side of the clearing. Shadow, larger than any of them, mane dark as the storm clouds gathering above. He approached slowly, lowering his head, every instinct in his body alive. The pride stiffened, tails flicking. Suri, or what remained of her line, stepped forward, snarling low. But Amara held her ground, staring hard at the approaching stranger. Ethan whispered, "Easy, boy, easy," though the glass and distance made the words useless. Shadow stopped a few feet from the group. The tension was so thick that even the air seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a motion almost too gentle for a predator, he stepped closer, head bowed. Amara moved first. She sniffed the air, then closed the distance until their noses nearly touched. A sound escaped her, half growl, half purr. A mother's recognition buried beneath years of instinct. For a heartbeat, they stood like statues in the wind. Then Amara leaned forward and brushed her head against his chest. The pride didn't attack. They only watched. Grace lowered her binoculars, blinking fast. "Is that?" Ethan nodded, his voice rough. "That's her. That's his mother." The moment stretched long, unbroken, except for the hum of cicadas and the low rumble of thunder beyond the hills. Shadow's tail flicked once, twice. Then he turned toward the horizon, Amara beside him, both of them silhouettes against the setting sun. When they finally disappeared into the tall grass, Ethan let out a breath that trembled on the way out. He wiped his eyes before anyone could see. Later that night, as they drove back to camp, Grace broke the silence. "You realize what just happened will sound impossible when we tell it." Ethan smiled faintly, eyes on the road. "That's all right. Some things are meant to sound impossible." The footage aired days later around the world, the reunion of the black lion and the mother who had once abandoned him. People called it divine, a miracle of nature, proof that love could outlast even evolution. But for Ethan, it was quieter than that. It wasn't redemption or spectacle. It was simply the earth keeping one small promise, that what is lost can, sometimes, find its way home. He wrote his last note in the old leather journal that night. Shadow has returned to the wild. Amara still leads. The circle is complete. If love exists in nature, it moves in silence. Outside his tent, the stars burned like 1,000 small fires, and somewhere out there, in the great dark plains, a lens roar rolled through the wind, deep, steady, and familiar. Ethan smiled in the dark. "Welcome home, Shadow," he whispered. "Welcome home." The year after Shadow's release became the quietest and the most meaningful of Ethan Carter's life. The world had moved on to new stories, new heroes, but out here on the Serengeti, time ran slower, gentler. Every dawn began the same way, golden light spilling across the endless plains, the sound of distant roars breaking through the mist, and the wind carrying the familiar scent of dust, rain, and something older than memory itself. Shadow had vanished after that day with Amara. The ranger's cameras caught him only in fragments, a flash of black fur in tall grass, a paw, print near the watering hole, a shadow crossing the plain at dusk. Some said he had joined his mother's pride. Others thought he'd gone rogue, living alone, as so many males do. Ethan didn't need proof. He knew in his bones that Shadow had found his place, whatever it was. Each week, Ethan drove out to the edge of the reserve, notebook on his lap, binoculars in hand. He would park under the same acacia tree where he had first seen Amara years ago, the same place where everything began. He never spoke, never called out, just listened. The silence of the savannah had a way of talking back if you let it. Sometimes at sunset, when the horizon turned the color of old embers, he thought he heard a low rumble rolling through the air. It was never close, never clear, but deep enough to move through him like a heartbeat. He would smile and whisper, "I hear you, old friend." Grace Holloway eventually left the sanctuary, returning to a university post in Nairobi. On her last night there, she and Ethan sat by the campfire, watching sparks rise into the wide African night. "You changed the story, you know," she said. "Not just for him, for everyone. You made people believe mercy still has a place in the wild." Ethan poked at the fire, listening to it crackle. "I didn't change anything. I just didn't look away." She smiled faintly. "Same thing, isn't it?" When she left the next morning, she pressed a notebook into his hand. Inside were her final research notes, the cover marked simply with a single sentence. In her handwriting, "Nature remembers kindness, even when we forget it." Years passed. The world outside kept spinning faster. New wars, new screens, new noise. But for Ethan, life slowed to the rhythm of the wind. His hair grayed, his step softened, and his eyesight began to blur around the edges. Still, he stayed. The sanctuary no longer needed him, but the land did. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Ethan climbed the small ridge that overlooked the plains. He carried no camera, only his binoculars and that old leather journal filled with years of ink and dust. Below, herds of antelope moved in slow, rippling lines, and the air trembled with the hum of cicadas. Then he saw it, a movement near the riverbank, almost invisible in the dying light. At first he thought it was just a shadow cast by the clouds, but then it moved again, and the shape grew clearer, a wind large and dark, mane brushed with streaks of rust and silver. Shadow. Ethan froze. Even from that distance, he recognized the smooth, heavy stride, the way the grass seemed to bow as he passed. Behind him, 3 younger lions followed, a small pride of their own, and walking among them was a lioness with a scar beneath her left eye. Amara! The breath caught in Ethan's chest. His heart stuttered, not from surprise, but from something deeper, something like peace. The pair moved together, heads low, tails flicking in rhythm, the cubs weaving between. Their legs, the family he had broken once by intervening, now stood whole again, restored not by human hands, but by time and grace. He lifted his binoculars one last time. The lions reached a mound of rock at the edge of the plain. Shadow climbed first, standing tall against the horizon. The setting sun framed his dark mane in gold, turning him into a silhouette of fire and night. Amara joined him, pressing her head against his chest, just as she had the day they reunited. Their cubs sat below, watching the world spread out before them, a world cruel, vast, and beautiful. Ethan lowered the binoculars slowly. His eyes burned, but he didn't blink them away. He opened his journal and wrote the final entry. He was born from darkness, rejected by instinct, saved by mercy. He walked between two worlds, ours and theirs, and found light in both. If love exists beyond reason, then it must live here, in the space where the wild forgives. The wind rose, lifting the pages, whispering through the grass. Somewhere out there, a lion's roar carried across the plain, long and deep, rolling over the land like thunder. It wasn't a cry for territory or warning. It was something purer, something that felt like thanks. Ethan closed the notebook, smiling to himself. "You did it," he said softly. "You found your way home." As the sky deepened into twilight, he turned his jeep back toward camp. The headlights cut two narrow paths through the darkness, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw movement beside him, just a flicker, a shape keeping pace with the vehicle before vanishing into the grass. He laughed under his breath. "Still watching me, huh?" That night, sleep came easy. The air was cool, the insects sang, and the stars hung low, clear, and bright. Ethan dreamed of the cub he'd once carried in his arms, now a full-grown lion walking free beneath the same sky. Months later, his book was published. It was simple, without fanfare, just a collection of stories, notes, and photographs bound in worn leather. Its title read, "The Lion Born in Darkness." It was dedicated to two beings, to Amara, who taught me what a mother's love can endure, and to Shadow, who showed me what it means to survive it. The last photograph in the book showed the silhouette of two lions standing on the ridge at sunset, one golden, one black. Beneath it, Ethan had written, "In nature, difference is often punished. But in the heart, difference is the reason we remember." Years later, travelers to the Serengeti would still tell stories of a black-maned lion who walked beside a golden lioness at dusk, their cubs trailing close, their voices rising together in the kind of music only the earth could understand. And somewhere beyond that horizon, where light meets shadow and silence becomes memory, Ethan Carter's words still echo in the wind. Love has no color, and mercy is the only law that matters. If this story touched something deep in you, if it reminded you that love can survive even in the wildest places, drop a simple 1 in the comments below. It may look like just a number, but every one tells us you were here, you felt it, and that these stories still matter. And if you want to walk beside us through the next journey, through more true tales of courage, loss, and the wild heart of nature, make sure to subscribe and turn on that little bell. There are more stories waiting out there in the tall grass, and we'd love to share them with you.